Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 1 of series 10. The question for today is, can a question of human existence as consciousness be coherently posed? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value. Just read the introduction. You also might like to read my book, Structures and Dynamics of Consciousness, which is on the topic. So to start with, the question of human existence is often thought too abstruse, amorphous, or even irrelevant to meaningful human life. But this view is out of date, and outdated ideas have been replaced. Religious mythology, for example, has been overtaken by psychology. Consciousness is understood with philosophy and phenomenology, and the concept of value has explained ethics, meaning and purpose. That is, a meaningful life is a worthwhile and valuable life lit up by values. And ethical principles are values that guide our actions. These observations indicate that value has a special place in our lives. It's not a synonym for good, nor a criterion of bias, nor a measure of quantification, but it's an experience or state of value that we can choose or will as well as receive. And as such, an affirmation or the will to value, leading to further value experiences, is a candidate for a prime human objective, or even as an answer to the question of human existence. Other candidates like knowledge or happiness are surprisingly inadequate in answering the big questions of life. Philosophy and science has been preoccupied with knowledge, but knowledge is only a means to an end. Happiness is an end that is inherently worthwhile, satisfying, and an acknowledged good. But happiness cannot provide morality, meaning, purpose, or the why of life. Questions of life must be ultimately answered in terms of human experience, mental states and consciousness. The question is, what kind of human experiences, mental states and states of consciousness? In my answer, I advocate the idea of value or the will to value as a principle or objective of life. And this can lead to other states of value that we could call an adequacy or a sufficiency of value. But this principle requires considerable explanation, although we can begin in this workshop. Yet it will take much longer to explain and demonstrate in many other discussions. It's also notable that viable theories of human existence are quite uncommon, even among philosophers, and there is certainly no other YouTube channel presenter offering such a comprehensive analysis. But the significance of this idea won't become apparent without explaining its wider context. That is, the status of value as a constituent of consciousness, together with other constituents of consciousness like cognition, affect and volition. And again, this view of value depends upon understanding the significance of consciousness as a conceptualization of human existence and as an integrative concept of cognition, affect, will and value. And this focus on consciousness and value is also crucial to delimiting the question of human existence. Yet this would only be a conceptual apprehension of value and consciousness. We would then have to ask, what can we do with the phenomenon of consciousness? And we need to know what that means in terms of ethics, meaning, purpose, and how to comport ourselves in the world. And this action still needs to be explained in terms of cognition, affect, will and value. But before that, we need to briefly define consciousness, reveal how it's been neglected and how it relates to value. To begin, John Searle provisionally defines consciousness as all the mental states that we can experience. I will eventually present an interactionist theory of mind and a structural conception of consciousness as a process or relation with structures like intentionality, graduation and divisibility. Yet we can start with the basic but modern distinction between mind and consciousness, often used interchangeably. Broadly speaking, mind is a more general category that can include every aspect of mental life, like genetics, the unconscious, and animal or insect minds, or perhaps even a societal mind. But consciousness is an aspect of mind with phenomenal properties like awareness and perception. And further to that, we can distinguish between pre-reflective animal consciousness and typically reflective human consciousness or self-consciousness. And of course, the physical brain can be distinguished from both mind and consciousness. Yet this mind-brain distinction raises a comparison of mind and consciousness with psychology and phenomenology. That is, psychology can be regarded as a study of the mind and the brain, whereas phenomenology can be regarded as an account of consciousness that claims universal structures of consciousness and or a transcendental ego. But despite all this, the neglect of the idea of consciousness in the ancient and the modern world continues to this day. The ancient Greek words pneuma and psyche translate as the breath of life and an animating principle. Religious thought used the words spirit or soul instead of mind or consciousness. Yet the term consciousness was only first written down by John Locke in 1681, and psychology as an explicit study of mind is barely 150 years old. Emphasizing this neglect, Edmund Husserl said that Descartes opened the door of consciousness but didn't go in. Yet Husserl hinted at structural reasons for this oversight, also noted by Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. There were many reasons why mind or consciousness has been overlooked in the ancient and the modern world. We lack both concepts and a rich language of mind. And unlike physical objects, mind is amorphous, transparent, and unquantifiable. But as recognized by Husserl and others, there are deeper structural reasons for the obscurity of consciousness. One of these is what we can call the non-referentiality of self-consciousness. That is, normally when we perceive objects, we invariably perceive them in contrast to others, like a black spot on a white board. But self-consciousness cannot apprehend other conscious beings in the same way that it apprehends itself. This results in an epistemological impediment that hinders the apprehension of consciousness. And in my view, this has radically obscured the idea of consciousness in academia and in common thought. An example of this radical misperception of consciousness is shown in a case of Barry Denton's distinction between the phenomenal self and the psychological self. The psychological self consists of thoughts, memories, affect states, inclinations, and values. The phenomenal self consists of the experience of existing as personal identity. In Denton's thought experiment, like in Star Trek, people are changed into data and teleported somewhere else. They are reconstructed exactly as before, down to every neuron and memory. They believe themselves to be the same person as before, that is their psychological self. This is because they have the same memories and psychological features as before, but the phenomenal self might not have the same phenomenal identity as before. So Denton considers the view that such teleportation is a form of suicide. This is a remarkable consideration that can only be made with an appreciation of the phenomenal self. And the fact that a phenomenal self exists and that it is often completely overlooked shows that this fundamental aspect of consciousness, and thereby consciousness itself, is also commonly misunderstood and overlooked to an alarming extent. These are some of the impediments that prefigure a philosophical enlightenment that centers on consciousness. But an awareness of consciousness also prefigures an awareness of value and how it relates to consciousness. As well as that, a neglect of mind or consciousness results in a neglect of value, and particular theories of mind have influenced subsequent theories of ethics and value. For example, Kant's rationalist theory of mind emphasized cognition and reason in determining ethical values. Contrary to Kant, Hume's empiricist theory of mind produced an empiricist or feeling-based ethics. Sartre's idea of consciousness as a lack of being similarly goes on to define value, but as a lack. And physicalist theories of mind tend to produce objectivist theories of value. Yet the intimate relation between consciousness and value is better explained by phenomenology. Heidegger, example, cites care as the being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value. He says that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. Sartre wants to trace choice as selection and thereby value back to its ontological foundation. He writes that choice isn't just preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. He says that every choice supposes elimination and selection, and elimination and selection are expressing the values of disfavour and approval or preference. The idea is illustrated with the earlier example of the contrast of a black spot on a white background. That is, a monotone is inimical to selection, choice and value, as well as to perception and consciousness. I have also argued this point in terms of an externalist theory of mind that needs a diverse external world. And both diversity and externalist theory of mind are compatible with Heidegger's being in the world. And in addition to value being fundamental to ethics, meaning, purpose, and practically every human activity, we can also then say that every perception entails contrast, selection and value. We look one way and make a selection and preference that produces an antithesis or negation. And we can say that value is ubiquitous in every aspect of our conscious lives, and that value and consciousness are coexistent. Yet despite the widespread significance of value, it has long been neglected, going back again to ancient times. Cruden's Biblical Concordance, for example, records 10 instances of the word, and then only as an adjective or verb. That is, the notion of value isn't recorded as a noun representing a substantive idea or state. As for ancient Greece, Marx tells us that Aristotle had no concept of value, but he may have overstated the point. Yet Aristotle doesn't neglect the Kantian moral features of goodwill and the value of people as end in themselves, and neither the fact value or the is-ought distinctions were familiar in ancient Greece. Moving forward to 1776, Etienne Bonnot was the first economist not to agree with objective or utility value theory. He considered that both value and utility have a psychological substrate and result from individual interest. Hume's discovery of the is-ought distinction also came late and is still often overlooked today. And in the 19th century, science regarded as objective and value-free, now it's seen as value-laden. Auguste Comte likewise advocated a positivist and value-free sociology as a form of social physics. This view was followed by Rudolf Carnap and logical positivism, and on this view, value judgments are senseless because they lack cognitive content. Summing this up and bringing us up to the present, Charles Gray Shaw wrote in the 20th century, I quote, "Value as a principle of ethics has been overlooked by both ancient and modern philosophy. My point is that the neglect of value means that something has probably been overlooked, and in my view, what has been overlooked is value as a principle of life." Yet my case for a principle of value isn't just its ubiquity in human activity and its place in the ontology of consciousness. It also rests on the inadequacy of the alternatives and the fact that value does what we need it to do. In order to clarify these alternatives, I've classified them with the four states of cognition, affect, will and value. These also clarify consciousness by naming the mental states that constitute consciousness, as well as clarifying the degree and variety of states that constitute different kinds of value. Yet analytic philosophy typically classifies consciousness into two distinct cognitive and non-cognitive states. But this classification is biased towards cognitivism and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So I supplement this classification using the above four states of cognition, affect, will and value. And in my view, this classification is comprehensive and describes consciousness exhaustively. Yet analytic philosophy tends to explain activities like morals and motivation in terms of cognition and reason. One argument for this view is that non-cognitive theories are said to be blind and unable to guide action. Yet cognitive theories are said to be impotent and unable to motivate action or morals. This is an example of how cognitive states might not provide adequate explanations. An illustrative question here is, do we eat an apple because we desire it or just because we see an apple? In this case, non-cognitivist motivation from desire is intuitively compelling. And issues of meaning and purpose also seem to need resolution in terms of non-cognitive experience. It's difficult to see how bare conceptions of things can satisfy issues of meaning and purpose. Yet ethical questions seem to be more complex and difficult to resolve. And later I will pose a supportive function of cognition for value states. These issues are the subject of an extensive cognitive, non-cognitive debate. Yet the above considerations, and that the cognitive states of reason and knowledge are means to an end, indicate that cognition alone isn't an adequate principle of life or a human objective. But if cognition doesn't provide an adequate principle, affect states are a common non-cognitive alternative. Affect states are emotions and feelings like pleasure and happiness, as well as negatives like pain and disgust. In its favour, happiness also figures in utilitarianism in its central principle of utility. And as social policy, the maximum happiness for the maximum number of people is difficult to dispute. But as a theory of ethics, it has serious inadequacies of justification and motivation. And happiness cannot answer questions of meaning, purpose, or the why of life. Like other states, the significance of the will depends on its function and how it is used and qualified. The will or volition is a variable state, ranging from Nietzsche's will to power to Kant's goodwill. And as a further feature, the ingredient required to motivate action can also be described as the will. But the will is a process or a vehicle embodied in action or a habit of thought following routine neural pathways. And in Nietzsche's will to power, it is a synonym for control, which is an ability, not a mental state. The will can't then be constituted of a state or an objective itself, as thinkers from Spinoza to Sartre agree. And as such, the will also isn't a viable candidate as an explanatory human objective. Yet it might be a mistake to look for one kind of state, because a principle of life might consist of multiple states, nor might we be able to argue states against each other, as they seem to overlap across a spectrum. Nietzsche, for example, proposed a justification by aesthetic value that included affective experience. Hilary Putnam presented an entanglement as the collapse of the fact-value dichotomy, and existentialists and others tend to describe value as volition. Yet this doesn't prevent us from considering each of these states in turn, or one of them, like value, as primary. In fact, we should consider them in combination, as I finally do in the idea of an ongoing dialectic. And in this way, these four states are the building blocks of more complex positions. But if the explanative power of cognition, affect, will, and even value does turn out to be insufficient, we would have to consider the significance of consciousness itself as a human objective. Consciousness is significant because it has the status of one of the fundamental modes of existence in the world. Consciousness isn't just a contingent entity like a particular species of fauna or flora. It is both the essentialia of human existence and a fundamental aspect of all existence. It is also an integrative concept of cognition, affect, will and value, and it thereby provides the basic awareness that enables us to ask fundamental questions, or the fundamental question of human existence. Yet even more than that, all human experience and human existence must be placed within consciousness. This approach is endorsed from phenomenologists to Jungian von Franz and neuroscientist Sam Harris. That is, all human experiences must ultimately occur within the boundaries of consciousness, and all human issues must, in the final analysis, be resolved in relation to consciousness, and that, like death, consciousness is one of the basic parameters of human existence. Yet even this kind of significance of consciousness as human existence or as a mode of being isn't enough. The kind of significance that we ultimately need isn't due to the status of consciousness in the world, nor is it due to the significance of theories of consciousness in explaining human thought or action. It is due to the subjective significance that we can attribute to these elements as experiences in our lives. For that, we must look to value as both a legislature of significance and as a constituent of consciousness. But before discussing that, we need to say more about the idea of consciousness as a human objective. The problem is that consciousness, or its increase, isn't a viable principle, solution, or an objective in itself. This is the case for at least three following reasons. 1. Consciousness itself, as consciousness, doesn't specify the particular properties that may provide resolution, and the idea of the increase or higher levels of consciousness doesn't resolve this deficit, but exacerbates it. This is evident in both New Age thinking and in Thomas Metzinger's ethic of consciousness, that have both failed to provide viable theoretical explanations. 2. Consciousness incurs problems like anxiety, anomie, fragmentation, alienation, guilt, and awareness of finitude. And 3. Structures like temporality, divisibility, and graduation render consciousness intrinsically problematic. More specifically, temporality produces impermanence, change, choice, responsibility and anxiety. Divisibility creates problems like personal fragmentation, internal conflicts and alienation. And graduation means that we can not only develop but also diminish and eventually die. And in my view, the combined structural problems of consciousness can be described as insubstantiality. Sartre opposes the insubstantiality of consciousness in relation to the independence and permanence of physicality. Yet I propose a more realistic response as a sufficiency of value, not a sufficiency of physical features. But even Sartre might ask, how can ontological problems of existence be resolved in terms of value? For example, he himself says that ontology itself cannot formulate ethical precepts. But the ontological structures of consciousness aren't just abstract principles. They also represent visceral human experiences such as anxiety, alienation and personal fragmentation. And as such, they can be ameliorated or resolved with the help of other human capacities such as thought, belief, reason and value. As an example of resolving ontological problems of existence in terms of value, let's say you lose $50. You can either resolve the problem materially by being reimbursed or by coming to terms with your loss with the benefits and consolations of that outcome. Yet this raises the question of how can value be the kind of thing that can do this? This brings us to my final argument for value as a principle of life. This isn't just its ubiquity and its ontology, or the inadequacy of the alternatives, but the fact that value can do what we need it to do. That is, value does what we need it to do in ethics, meaning, purpose and aesthetics, but also in terms of its properties like self-validation and sufficiencies of value. Yet confronting these problems are such as the possible priority of other states over value and the problem of justification posed by Hume's is-ought distinction and More's naturalistic fallacy. Yet with respect to the facts of ontology, cognition, like value, is also a fundamental constituent of consciousness. But as I explain here, cognition is not able to do what value is able to do. And in the case of Hume's is-ought, the issue arises by beginning with facts, as in academic discussions. But we can start with values, as shown above, with the coexistence of value and consciousness, expressed in the affirmation or the will to value, leading to further value choices. This predisposition of value can be explained with the principle of the self-validation of values and ethical values. Such a predisposition or self-validation of values or morals has been previously proposed by such as Nietzsche, Williams and Dawkins, who looked at the self-contained nature of ethics. Self-validating principles are used to justify logic and mathematics, but not thought possible in physics or ethics. Logic is determined by the self-evident and self-validating truths of Aristotle's 4 basic principles of logic. David Hilbert describes mathematics as avoidance of contradiction and is therefore a self-validating a priori. A self-validating system within the human sphere is Descartes' I think therefore I am. Physics isn't self-validating because it's an a posteriori system of contingent observations. Mathematics and logic are self-validating, but they can't establish principles for systems of physics or ethics. And I propose that the will to value can also be self-validating. This is because value can be sufficient in itself, and because the alternative, not to value value is contradictory and self-negating or self-defeating. Let's look at the idea of value sufficiency before discussing the others. The idea of value sufficiency responds to both the questions of self-validation and what does the will to value lead to or amount to. Yet it need not lead to anything. It could be its own reward as a value or as a valid theory. But I hold that the will to value or the value of value results in a certain sufficiency of value. That is, the will to value evokes the kinds of value that enjoy a sufficiency of value, and that the will to value aggregates values of increasing substantiality. Previous examples of sufficient values were self-esteem, dignity, courage, patience, and magnanimity. Historical examples are the idea of God as a development of the believer's highest value, denoting sufficiency. And Aristotle's eudaimonia is the supreme good, which he also qualifies as self-sufficient. And as eudaimonia is a moral concept, it can be inferred to be a sufficiency of value. I have also noted other kinds of sufficient states in happiness and pleasure. Yet, of course, human finitude means that sufficiencies are always insufficient and are works in progress. And that is why the preceding principle is a will to value, involving a dialectic outlined shortly. Yet I also propose that not to value value is contradictory, self-negating and self-defeating. Firstly, not to value value is self-defeating because our primary objectives are formed in terms of value. For example, as noted, ethical principles are values that guide moral actions, and a meaningful life is also a valuable and worthwhile life lit up by values. Secondly, not to value value is self-negating because what we are as conscious beings is largely constituted by value. Heidegger, for example, asserts that our fundamental mode of existence is care, which cannot be escaped. And Paul Ricoeur identifies personal identity with internalized values to determine who I am. And thirdly, not to value value is contradictory because value is presupposed in all our thoughts, choices and actions. That is, not to value value negates the principle of value that drives and culminates our conscious existence. And this implies the principle of the will to value that underlines this presentation. Yet this kind of contradiction can also be illustrated with Sartre's repudiation of the spirit of seriousness. The spirit of seriousness misrepresents subjective values as objective to avoid freedom and responsibility. The classic example is to say, in bad faith, that I have no choice. This makes the error of taking the idea of I have no choice as brute fact or an objective value. This is a failure to value value because it is a refusal to choose, and choice is an intrinsic property of value, and not to choose is a negation of value. It is also a failure to value value because it is valuing an object or principle as an objective or intrinsic value. But arguably, only people as self-conscious beings and mental states are candidates of intrinsic value. On this view, principles or objects only have instrumental value attributed them by people. So to take principles or objects of having intrinsic value is a contradiction of value, and it is also a contradiction of the will to value. So Sartre's concept of the spirit of seriousness illustrates two ways of failing to value value. One, in a failure to value as a refusal to choose, and two, valuing objects or principles as intrinsic values, not only contradictory but also regressive and simply erroneous. Yet again, human finitude means that the will to value and sufficiencies of value are always insufficient and are works in progress. Human beings aren't absolute spirits with sufficient value, able to confront every contingency. People need supportive ideas like religious belief, political ideals, and ideologies. This constitutes a dialectic between these cognitive frameworks and value states. And religion can be usefully cited as a paradigm example of a supporting cognitive framework. In religion, God is a believer's highest conceivable value, together with a pantheon of other values. Belief in God, doctrine, and church structures provide a cognitive support for the value experience. Social esteem and other people's regard is another huge part of a supporting yet relative cognitive framework. My usual example is of a 5-year-old who needs parental approval not required by a 25-year-old. Yet both the examples of a child and of religion show we are dealing with a process of development, and in that development we can see a preference for independence and a sufficiency of value. And as maintained here, values and human experience are always entangled with supporting cognitive frameworks. And it's the case that value and value sufficiency is in a dialectical relation with these cognitive frameworks. Yet value sufficiency is driven by the principle of value seeking further value, the value as the will to value. In this dialectic, value seeks independence from cognitive support, which produces further value. And this value again needs support, which again seeks further value. This is the dialectic between the relative sufficiency of value states and supporting cognitive frameworks. Yet the relative sufficiency of value is a sufficiency expressed in such ways as moral fortitude and self-esteem. In this way, the theoretical principle of the will to value is also a principle in life and in life experience. I conclude with the principles of the will to value and the sufficiency of value in answer to the question of human existence, and that these follow from structures of consciousness different from Kant's and Hume's theories of mind. These were not able to adequately resolve problems of priority and justification of value. But as implied, values derived from structures of consciousness already contain inclinations and volitions, and these inescapably direct value by means of authentic choice and affirmation, or the will to value. Yet the story of these principles doesn't begin in theories of ethics or other such human activities. It begins with the obfuscation, neglect and realization of the significance of consciousness. And we noted particular problems in apprehending both consciousness and value. Yet my case for a principle of value and the will to value didn't just rest on its ubiquity and its place in ontology, but it also rests on the inadequacy of the alternatives and the fact that value does what we need it to do. That is, not only in terms of ethics, meaning and purpose, but also in properties of self-validation and value sufficiency. With respect to consciousness, we saw that its analysis in terms of cognition, affect, will and value resulted in comparisons and contrasts of these states that led to value as the salient state in this inquiry. Yet as a state of consciousness, the significance of value was enhanced, not just as a fundamental aspect of the world, but also in its relations to selections, choice and preference as fundamental aspects of consciousness. The consequences for ethics, meaning and human purpose is the discovery of a principle of life in terms of value. That is, long-standing values like ethical fortitude and independence from social endorsement find a new basis, and that a guiding principle can be produced from the subjective structures of consciousness. I will be working through such aspects of consciousness in forthcoming workshops. The kind of response to this work that I'm looking for is either a recognition of how a clarification might have been made of the enigma of human existence, or as well as refutations and criticisms showing how I might have been mistaken. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.